So we continue our look at industrialization in the 19th century, looking at communication. Our learning objectives. Understand the role the development of communication technologies had on industrialization and analyze the impacts of those developments. Communication. When we talk about communication, we are talking about the technologies that connect different places together. So communication is both about the spreading of information. That is, if I call you and say, hey dude, our telephone is a communication technology. But another communication link is actually transport, trading, that allows people to connect in terms of the goods they consume and produce. All right. So as we spoke about previously, it was that combination of fuel with the steam engine. And so this is just like a quick run through of the changes we're seeing. The first steamboat worked a canal in England in 1801. In 1830, you still have sailing ships still dominating seas, and it took 2 years. Can you imagine if you sent a letter from India to England, it took you 2 years to get an answer? Whew. By 1850, it took 2 or 3 months by steamship. That is a dramatic cut in time. So because we have this quick technology, we have better communication and connection between places that are literally half a world apart. By 1870, the telegram from India to England gets an answer within hours. So the pace of communication is able to speed up. So looking at our handy dandy map, we can see where the first railway line was established in each country. And if you look to the lower right-hand side, there is a key for you. I would like you to pause this and consider, knowing everything that you know so far, why do you think countries in Eastern Europe took longer to develop railroads? Okay. Before we move on, I would like you to pause and review the information that you have already read on steam engines and roads and waterway transport. Now, I'm going to move on because I know all of y'all did, because y'all are great like that, right? So this is just kind of like a review of, again, another form of transport. So in 1801, the first steam train in 1804 pulled 20 tons at 5 miles an hour. Keep in mind that the average speed of a horse, full gallop, carrying no load, is 28 miles an hour. So, I mean, yeah, it's moving a lot more than a horse could, but then again, it's also not moving that fast. The first public railway opened in Britain in 1830, pulling 40 tons at 16 miles an hour. And railways began operating before 1840 in France, Germany, Belgium, the US, and Canada, before 1860 in India, Brazil, Argentina, and South Africa, and before 1870 in Japan, and 1882 in China. In 1902, a 124 mile per hour, wow, speed record was set by an electric locomotive in Germany. And what we have here is an image of telegraph. So one of the things that happened is as railways were being created, they were also putting up telegraphs at the same time. So essentially, some of these rail stations became telegraph stations, and towns grow up around communication links. Whether or not we have big cities in places like New York and Hong Kong and London because of the communication or transport links, trade links that the harbors provide, but also along railway lines. The railroads, as we know, spurred industrial development it became much cheaper to transport things instead of trying to send it over land, and you were safer in sending stuff by railroad because there was less likelihood that you could get robbed, although you did have like an increase in people robbing trains. But this also meant that markets could become huge. So before, your market, the people that you could sell to, was limited to a small area. Now your market can be the whole country, and with steam engines, it became the whole world. Railroads also spurred urbanization, as we've spoken about before, in terms of now that there is a railroad somewhere, then businesses will start clumping around that railroad because they have these markets that they can easily access and cheaply access. And now that you have the industry there, then people will come to work in that industry. Then more people will come to provide support services for the people who work in the industry, etc., etc. And here's a handy dandy image of a British steam train. Chugga, 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 choo-choo, crisscrossing the country, opening markets. Industrialization and all of the stuff that goes along with it is going to also have profound effects outside of just the goods we consume. Here we have an image of German soldiers on their way to the front in 1914. This means that we can mass produce guns, we can mass produce bullets, we can build trains and railways to get more people to go fight wars. And so you're going to have wars that have an unprecedented impact on people's lives, including deaths. Which brings us to a red question. Even today, the extent of a country's rail networks is used as a measure of development. Why do you think this is so? All right, which brings us to talk about mass communication. And when we're talking about mass communication, this is more about information now. So we have new machines, which brings us to faster printing presses. And we've spoken about the printing press before and the impacts that it had on society and the numbers of people that it could now share information with. Now think about that number becoming ever greater. And this is the beginning of a mass culture. That is a culture that a lot of people are part of instead of little pockets. Think about it this way, right? The internet is a form of mass communication. How many people know about the Kardashians, even though they're not living in the US or they don't personally know the Kardashians? Sadly, even I do. And you see, this is some of the innovations that we still see today. With this development of mass communication and mass culture, we see this still today. We have increased advertising, cartoons, headlines, comics, advice columns, fashion pages. So the things that, we like to read about or the things we like to see, this is when they start coming. Newspapers are now being marketed to the working classes, not just the richy rich, but it's being marketed to the working classes. Magazines move away from the elite stories. So, there's stuff about like good housekeeping and cooking and all sorts of stuff. You now have the first recorded music. This means you do not have to be wealthy to have access to the culture of music. And this is actually going to have a profound change in the type of music and the way music is recorded and the way music is played. Before, you only had access to music if you were there. Like if you were rich enough to be able to afford to go to a concert. Now we start having popular music and an explosion in different kinds. So, how do you think the rise in mass communication will impact government and change other things socially? I didn't go into great detail about mass communication because this is stuff that you know. So apply your knowledge. All right, guys, I'm about to wrap it up. Remember, when we're talking about the Industrial Revolution, we're talking about a long period of time. So from 1750 to 1914. Not as long as the Renaissance, but still a nice chunk of time. In terms of communication, it began with horse-drawn canals. Then we have the development of steam engines and the telegraph. Then we have the development of airplanes. So we go from pulling things using animal power in canals at the beginning to we're up in the air. In terms of energy, we go from mining coal, essentially still by hand, to oil pumps, petroleum. Massive changes. And it's going to result in changes in how people live, etc. We also see these massive changes in world energy consumption. So we're not just talking about coal, but we're talking about overall energy consumption in a relatively short period of time. Biofuels, what might that be? And you see the increase in coal usage, and then by the time we get to the night from 1914, 1915, you see the beginning of oil, which brings us to where we are today. In terms of this energy, we see that it's going to have a massive impact on where people live. Even today, the population density in Europe connects to the former coal fields. And I say former because a lot of them are played out and no longer being used as sources of fuel. But once you have a coal field, especially if it's close to iron, you have the development of industry, you have building of railroads, you have unskilled laborers coming from the countryside to work, you have them bringing their families, and you have these cities expanding and growing. Even to today, you can see the impacts of this. Surprise! Okay, this one is a bit of an oldie, but it totally fits in with what we've been talking about. A little bit about communication. Why was the crow perched on a telephone wire? He was going to make a long distance call! Call! That one is pretty good. You know it. The end.